Is there any frustration, because you guys are in a really fantastic run, that this is distracting from that?
You know, there is a frustration, of course, because we want to talk about basketball and we want to continue to work on our game and we want to continue to grow as a team. But I also understand, like, this is part of our growth edge as a league, right? It's part of our growth edge as a league, and you know, we have to be able to manage. We have to be able to insulate as much as we can, and then we have to be able to lead with conversation.
Hey, for supporters, well, my goodness, the WNBA cannot stay out of their own way, and they will gripe about people making videos about this when you literally created this controversy yourself. We got Stephanie White making comments about the fact that she can't scientifically identify the difference between a man and a woman. That's real. We got the Portland Fire coach also making comments. We got girls from Sophie's rally, the rally supporting Sophie Cunningham, making comments, but that's not where we're going to start.
When Caitlin Clark stepped onto the WNBA court this season, she didn't just bring her incredible talent. She brought something the league had been desperately chasing for nearly 3 decades: mainstream attention. Millions of new viewers suddenly tuned in, sponsors circled, and major networks finally started covering women's basketball like it mattered. After years of struggling in obscurity, the WNBA had finally caught lightning in a bottle. But then something shocking happened. Instead of embracing this golden moment, the league started actively sabotaging its own growth. We're talking about head coaches freezing up on camera, unable to answer basic questions, PR teams physically shutting down live press conferences, paying fans getting booed in arenas. And all of it happening while league executives publicly claim they desperately want the league to succeed. What we're witnessing isn't random chaos. It's a deeply systematic, intentional pattern of self-destruction that's unfolding in real time. The question isn't whether the WNBA has the talent or the opportunity to succeed. The question is whether the people running it are willing to stop getting in their own way long enough to actually capitalize on the most pivotal moment in the league's entire history. And based on what's happening right now, the answer is becoming painfully obvious. Let's start with what everyone saw, but maybe didn't fully process. After Caitlin Clark recorded a triple-double, the kind of performance that should have been celebrated as a historic achievement, she walked off the court with an expression that told you everything you needed to know. This wasn't frustration about the game. This wasn't disappointment about the score. This was something deeper. This was the look of someone watching a professional sports league actively, intentionally sabotage its own explosive growth in real time. And the crazy part? The chaos had nothing to do with what happened on the court. It had everything to do with what was happening off it. Just before that game, Indiana Fever head coach Stephanie White was asked a straightforward question by a reporter. What's your stance on biological males participating in women's sports? It's the kind of question that's been debated everywhere from Congress to local school boards. It's a topic dominating national conversation. It's something any head coach of a professional women's sports league should have a basic answer prepared for. But instead of giving a direct response, Stephanie White did something remarkable. She essentially claimed scientific ignorance. She said she wasn't educated enough to answer. She said she didn't believe exclusion was the answer. She pivoted to talking about playing with boys growing up. And when pressed directly about whether she'd welcome a biological male in the WNBA, she gave vague responses about not being educated enough on the science of transitioning. Think about that for a second. The head coach of the most scrutinized, most watched team in women's basketball history, the team with the biggest superstar the league has ever seen, looked directly into a camera and told a credentialed reporter that she couldn't scientifically define what makes women's sports different from men's sports. It wasn't just evasive, it was embarrassing, and it set the tone for everything that came next. But here's where this story gets genuinely interesting. While the league's leadership was tying itself in knots trying to dodge basic questions, something unexpected happened on the ground level. Real fans, actual paying customers who had just discovered women's basketball because of Caitlin Clark, decided they had something to say. These weren't activists or professional protesters. These were young women who loved sports, loved basketball, and loved what Sophie Cunningham had done. Cunningham, a professional player on the Portland Fire, had made a simple statement. She'd said that she believes biological males shouldn't compete in women's professional sports. It was said respectfully. It was said thoughtfully. It didn't attack anyone personally. She simply stated a position that, according to multiple national surveys, the overwhelming majority of Americans actually agree with. And that's when things got wild. Fans organized. They bought actual full-price tickets. They drove to the Moda Center in Portland specifically to support Sophie Cunningham and her right to express that view. These weren't people trying to disrupt the game or ruin anyone's experience. They were doing exactly what sports leagues beg fans to do. They were showing up, buying tickets, and engaging with the product. They were spending their own money to support a player they believed in. From a pure business perspective, this should have been celebrated as organic fan engagement at its finest. This should have been a moment where the league recognized that they had accidentally built a broader, more diverse fan base that included people with different perspectives and different backgrounds. Instead, the league's response was to treat it like a crisis. The PR machinery kicked into overdrive, defensive postures were taken, press conferences started getting shut down. When a reporter from Outkick, a major platform owned by Fox Corporation with millions of daily readers, showed up to ask perfectly reasonable questions, he got physically shut out of the press conference. Think about the absolute insanity of that decision. Outkick had never cared about women's basketball before. The only reason they suddenly started covering the WNBA intensely is because Caitlin Clark made the league relevant and interesting to their massive mainstream audience. And instead of welcoming that massive new readership with open arms, the Fever's response was to treat them like they were some fringe operation unworthy of access. And then there's what happened in the arena itself. The crowd in Portland actually booed Sophie Cunningham. They booed her not for poor play. They booed her not for dirty tactics or anything that happened on the court. They booed her solely for expressing a mainstream view about women's sports. Think about what that moment represents. You have paying fans being treated like unwelcome guests in the arena because their perspective doesn't align with what the league has decided is the approved political viewpoint. The league wasn't protecting its players. It was creating an environment where expressing a mainstream opinion could get you aggressively booed by your own fans. What makes all of this so incredible is that none of it was necessary. Sophie Cunningham could have expressed her views. The league could have simply said that all players are entitled to their own beliefs. The reporter from Outkick could have asked his questions and gotten standard, boring coach-speak answers. And then everyone would have moved on to talking about basketball. But that's not what happened. Instead, at every single turn, the league and its teams made the choice to escalate. They made the choice to transform minor moments into massive cultural controversies. They made the choice to manufacture drama where none needed to exist. And in doing so, they revealed something deeply troubling about how they actually view the new mainstream audiences that Caitlin Clark brought to women's basketball. Let's zoom in on the coaching responses to this controversy, because they tell you everything you need to know about the institutional dysfunction happening at the highest levels of the WNBA. Stephanie White's response was evasive and corporate, but it was almost graceful compared to what came next. When Alex Samra, the Portland Fire coach, got asked the same straightforward question, his response was somehow even worse. He told the reporter that as a basketball coach, he'd never had to think about what biologically defines women's sports. Stop and really process that statement. You are a professional head coach earning a substantial paycheck in a women's professional sports league, and you're claiming you've never once considered what actually makes women's sports distinct from men's sports. That statement is either a deliberate lie to save face, or it's a wildly disqualifying admission of professional negligence. There's no middle ground there. What makes this even more egregious is how Samra handled the follow-up. The reporter was just doing their job. They were asking a perfectly reasonable professional question about competitive fairness in women's sports. And Samra's response was to pivot to generic talking points about supporting people from all communities and walks of life. Here's the critical thing that most people miss. He was answering a completely different question than the one he was asked. The reporter never asked whether he generically supports people in society. The question was incredibly specific. It was about competitive fairness in a professional sports setting. And Samra's deliberate conflation of those two separate issues is textbook public relations misdirection. Think about what this reveals.
All right, so we're here at it's the Fever and the Fire game at the Moda Center, and these young women showed up to do what?
We showed up tonight here in support of Sophie Cunningham and her stance on biological men in women's sports, and being the first professional athlete to stand up and say that she doesn't think it's fair, and do it in a very respectful, kind, and loving way. So we're here to support her.
We're here to support Sophie in keeping women's sports about women and girls. Bravo. Bravo. The league is a mess.
The coaches aren't just being evasive, they're being trained to be evasive. These are scripted, calculated responses that come from media training and PR coaching. Nobody naturally responds to a straightforward question by talking about supporting people from all communities unless someone has specifically coached them to do so. These responses aren't coming from the coach's actual positions. They're coming from a playbook that's been distributed throughout the league. Someone at the WNBA front office has clearly issued guidance on how to handle this topic, and the guidance is essentially avoid, deflect, and redirect to corporate buzzwords. The really damning part comes when the reporter actually does their job and pushes for a direct answer. Samra literally tells him, "I think I've given my answer already on that question. I don't feel like I need to go further." No, he absolutely didn't give an answer. Everyone watching that clip knows exactly what happened. The coach was terrified of the backlash, so he dodged it completely. And then he had the audacity to act like he'd already answered when he categorically had not. This is a head coach of a professional sports team refusing basic accountability to a legitimate media outlet. And the scariest part is that he felt comfortable doing it. He felt protected enough by the institutional structure of the league to just shut down a reporter on camera and move on. Now let's talk about what Stephanie White said about needing to insulate the league. She literally used that word in a press conference. The team needs to insulate itself. Insulate from what, exactly? The paying fans who finally showed up, the mainstream media outlets that are finally covering your games, the new audiences that Caitlin Clark brought in. What exactly are you trying to insulate yourselves from? You spent nearly 30 years begging for this exact moment. You spent 3 decades struggling with abysmal television ratings and weak arena attendance. You watched mainstream media completely ignore your league. And now that you finally have the attention and the new audiences and the financial opportunity you've been dreaming about, your response is to build a wall and insulate yourselves from it. The word insulate reveals the actual mentality driving league leadership. They don't see the new audiences as an opportunity. They see them as a threat. They don't see mainstream media attention as something to be welcomed. They see it as something to be controlled and managed. They don't view fans with different perspectives as people who should be welcome in their arenas. They view them as a problem to be contained. That's not how you build a successful professional sports league. That's how you systematically destroy one while claiming to want it to succeed. And here's the thing that really gets me. Both of these coaches tried to use inclusive, progressive language while simultaneously engaging in the most exclusionary behavior possible. Stephanie White talked about how exclusion is never the answer while her team was literally excluding reporters from press conferences. She talked about leading with conversation while simultaneously preventing conversations from happening. She talked about managing growth while actively contracting the tent and pushing away new audiences. The contradiction between their words and their actions is so stark that it becomes the story itself. And that contradiction is happening at every level of the league's institutional structure. What happened with the Outkick reporter needs to be understood in its proper context, because it's not some isolated incident. It's a perfect microcosm of how the WNBA's leadership actually views mainstream media and the new audiences their league has finally attracted. Let's be clear about what Outkick is, because this matters. Outkick is a legitimate major media platform. It's owned by Fox Corporation. It has millions upon millions of dedicated daily readers. It's a genuine, credentialed media outlet. The only reason Outkick suddenly started covering women's basketball intensely is because Caitlin Clark made the WNBA relevant and interesting to their massive mainstream audience. This is free publicity. This is access to audiences the league could never have reached before. This is exactly the kind of mainstream attention that women's basketball has been desperately trying to attract for decades. And how did the Indiana Fever respond? By shutting down the press conference and treating Outkick like they were some illegitimate fringe operation. The PR handler literally physically stepped in and ended the conference specifically to prevent the reporter from asking any more questions. Think about the message that sends. You're telling one of the biggest media platforms in the country that they're not welcome to ask questions about your team. You're telling millions of readers that if they want to know about the WNBA, they should look somewhere else. You're deliberately burning bridges with people who were just starting to care about your product. This is where the institutional dysfunction becomes undeniable. The league spent nearly 3 decades trying to get mainstream media outlets to care about women's basketball. They begged for coverage. They pleaded for attention. They complained constantly about how they were being ignored compared to the men's game. And then, the moment a major mainstream media outlet finally shows up, because they've become genuinely interested in covering the league's response is to shut them down and treat them like they're unwelcome. But here's the thing that makes this even worse. The reporter wasn't asking anything unreasonable. He was asking basic, foundational questions about a topic that's being debated nationally. He wasn't ambushing anyone. He wasn't being disrespectful. He was doing his job as a journalist. And for doing his job, he got physically removed from a press conference. That's not professional communication. That's not managing a crisis. That's panic. That's institutional fear. That's an organization that's so terrified of certain conversations that it's willing to take extreme action to prevent them from happening. The psychological message being sent here is incredibly important to understand. Every reporter, every media outlet, every fan who witnessed this exchange got a very clear message. If you ask certain questions, if you express certain viewpoints, if you don't perfectly align with the league's preferred perspective, you will be shut down. You will be excluded. You will be treated as unwelcome. That's not a recipe for building trust with a broader audience. That's a recipe for creating hostility and resentment among the exact people you're trying to attract. And the timing of all this is absolutely critical. This is happening in a moment when Caitlin Clark has brought in millions of new viewers who had never watched women's basketball before. These new viewers are diverse. They have different political perspectives. They have different backgrounds. Some of them are conservative. Some of them are moderate. Some of them don't care about politics at all and just want to watch great basketball. But all of them are brand new to the WNBA, and they're in a vulnerable position where they're still figuring out whether they want to invest in this league long-term. And what's the message they're receiving? They're receiving a message that the league doesn't actually want them. That the league prefers a smaller, more ideologically homogeneous fan base to a larger, more diverse one. From a pure business perspective, this is absolutely insane. You have a golden opportunity to expand your audience, to build a bigger tent, to bring in new demographics that have never cared about women's basketball before. And instead of welcoming those new audiences with open arms, you're actively antagonizing them. You're making them feel unwelcome. You're treating the media outlets that cover them like they're illegitimate. You're creating an environment where expressing a mainstream view gets you booed in the arena. Think about the typical casual sports fan who just discovered women's basketball because of Caitlin Clark. They tune in, they watch an incredible game, they see fantastic athleticism and high-level competition. They want to learn more, so they go online. And what do they find? They find stories about coaches who are terrified to define what a woman is on camera. They find stories about press conferences being shut down. They find stories about paying fans being treated like they're not welcome in the arena. And the natural conclusion they reach is, maybe this league doesn't want people like me. Maybe I should go back to watching sports that don't make me feel like an outsider for asking normal questions. That's not a failure of the product on the court. That's a failure of institutional leadership off the court. And it's a failure that's entirely self-inflicted. Let's talk about something that almost never gets discussed in mainstream sports coverage, but it's absolutely fundamental to understanding what's happening here. The WNBA has been entirely artificially subsidized by the men's NBA for its entire existence. We're talking about nearly 3 decades of financial losses. The league has never once turned a single dollar of actual profit. It has never achieved consistently sustainable mainstream television ratings. It has completely failed to establish true standalone financial independence as a sports entity. The WNBA exists today only because the NBA's owners have decided to keep it afloat, essentially as a loss leader or corporate charitable initiative. That's not meant as a criticism, it's just a fact. The league has been operating in a perpetual financial deficit for almost 30 years. And you know what? That was actually okay. That was acceptable because the league was investing in the future. They were building infrastructure. They were developing talent. They were hoping that someday they would reach a tipping point where the league could become self-sustaining. They were essentially playing the long game, understanding that they were spending money today in hopes of profitability tomorrow. And then something miraculous happened. Caitlin Clark arrived, and suddenly, that long-awaited tipping point was finally materializing. We're talking about genuine mainstream interest. We're talking about real money starting to flow into the league. We're talking about sponsors who had previously ignored women's basketball suddenly paying attention. We're talking about television networks that had never considered covering women's basketball before now actively seeking games to broadcast. The financial opportunity that the league had been dreaming about for 3 decades was finally, actually happening. For the first time in the league's history, the path to genuine financial sustainability was becoming visible. And this is where the tragedy of this moment really becomes apparent. Because at the exact moment when the WNBA had the opportunity to finally break free from its subsidized status and become a genuinely profitable, independently sustainable sports league, the people running it started actively pushing away the exact demographic of people who represent that financial opportunity. Think about the economics of this for a second. Caitlin Clark brought in millions of new viewers. Sophie Cunningham is now organically resonating with a completely different massive demographic, traditional sports fans, people who had never been reached by women's basketball before. From a pure business perspective, having multiple athletes who appeal to completely different sets of audiences is the holy grail. That's how you build a sustainable, massive professional sports league. You create multiple stars, you expand the tent, you welcome everyone who wants to participate. But instead of doing that, the WNBA front office is actively contracting. They're desperately trying to insulate their bubble from the outside world. They're obsessively trying to micromanage and control exactly who gets the privilege to ask questions and what pre-approved answers are deemed culturally acceptable. And in doing so, they're systematically burning relationships with the exact people who could finally make the league financially viable. Consider what they're currently squandering. You have unprecedented mainstream attention. You have multiple stars pulling in different demographics. You have major national media outlets that had never considered covering you before now actively seeking your content. You have thousands of brand new enthusiastic fans physically showing up to buy merchandise and attend games. You have sponsors who are suddenly interested. You have networks that are suddenly willing to broadcast your games. When you add it all up, absolutely everything that the WNBA has loudly, publicly claimed they desperately wanted for the last 3 decades is literally happening right now in real time. All the pieces are in place for them to finally win big. And yet, somehow, against all conceivable odds, they're completely fumbling the bag. They're fumbling it deliberately with intent. They're fumbling it systematically across multiple franchises and coaching staffs. And they're doing it repeatedly, day after day, refusing to learn a single lesson from the disaster of the day before. Here's the fundamental business reality that nobody at the league office ever wants to acknowledge. You simply cannot build a billion-dollar entertainment business on the foundation of intentional exclusion, while simultaneously running PR campaigns claiming that you vehemently oppose exclusion. You cannot organically grow your viewer audience by systematically insulting and aggressively pushing away every single potential customer who doesn't already 100% agree with your specific political worldview. And you absolutely cannot hope to achieve true, lasting mainstream cultural success while you're simultaneously treating massive established mainstream media outlets like they're somehow completely illegitimate and unworthy of your time. The proven blueprint for success in the sports entertainment industry is incredibly simple and has been tested successfully by every major league that exists today. You actively create and promote multiple distinct stars who naturally appeal to entirely different sets of cultural audiences. You purposefully expand the size of the tent to fit as many paying customers as humanly possible. You open the doors and you enthusiastically welcome that explosive growth. But the WNBA is doing the exact opposite. And every single decision they're making is actively, measurably making it harder for the league to achieve the financial sustainability it's been chasing for 3 decades. Here's something that deserves serious unpacking, and it goes to the absolute heart of what makes this situation so revealing about the WNBA's institutional priorities. Stephanie White, the Indiana Fever head coach, made a point of saying that exclusion is never the answer. It sounds great on a bumper sticker. It sounds noble and progressive and inclusive, but let's look at the actual reality of what's happening while she's saying this. What do you call it when your team literally shuts down a live press conference, specifically to prevent a certain media outlet from being able to ask perfectly valid questions? That's exclusion. What exactly do you call it when an entire arena crowd is allowed to ruthlessly boo paying fans just because they chose to support a player's fundamental right to express her own mainstream views? That's exclusion. What do you call it when you're deliberately creating an intimidating work environment where grown adult head coaches literally feel financially compelled to pretend on camera that they cannot understand basic human biology? That's exclusion. It's just a highly targeted, sanitized form of exclusion aimed squarely at the specific group of people that the league office has arrogantly decided aren't culturally welcome to be part of their new financial growth. This is the core hypocrisy at the center of everything that's happening. The league is preaching one message in public, a message about inclusion and conversation and dialogue, while actively practicing the exact opposite message through their actions. And the people being excluded aren't marginalized or vulnerable groups. They're the exact mainstream audiences that the league has been desperately trying to attract for 3 decades. They're the people who represent genuine financial opportunity for the first time in the league's history. Think about what true inclusion would actually look like in this situation. True inclusion would mean welcoming the new audiences that Caitlin Clark brought in, regardless of their political perspectives. True inclusion would mean greeting a major mainstream media outlet like Outkick with professional courtesy instead of hostility. True inclusion would mean allowing Sophie Cunningham to express her mainstream views without fear of being aggressively booed in her own arena. True inclusion would mean head coaches feeling comfortable enough to answer straightforward questions directly instead of hiding behind corporate buzzwords and claims of scientific ignorance. But that's not what the league is doing. Instead, the league is practicing what we might call ideological exclusion. They've decided that there's a very narrow set of acceptable viewpoints, and anyone who falls outside that set is not welcome. Anyone who expresses a mainstream view about women's sports is treated as a threat to be managed. Anyone who represents a demographic outside the league's ideological bubble is viewed with suspicion and hostility. And anyone who tries to report on these issues from a perspective that doesn't align with the league's preferred narrative gets physically shut out of press conferences. Here's what makes this even more damaging. This kind of exclusion is being practiced by an organization that has absolutely no economic luxury to be exclusive. The WNBA cannot afford to turn away customers. The WNBA cannot afford to burn bridges with media outlets. The WNBA cannot afford to create hostile environments for any segment of potential fans. The league is still in a vulnerable financial position. It's still being subsidized by the men's NBA. It hasn't achieved true financial independence yet. And yet, it's behaving as if it's an established, secure, economically dominant industry that can afford to be selective about who gets to participate. Compare this to how the NFL operates, or the NBA, or Major League Baseball. Those leagues have worked incredibly hard to build broad, inclusive fan bases that span diverse political perspectives. They welcome fans with different viewpoints. They don't police the political opinions of their players or fans. They understand that their strength comes from their ability to appeal to as many people as possible, regardless of their backgrounds or perspectives. And because of that, those leagues are massive, profitable, and economically sustainable. The WNBA is essentially doing the inverse of that strategy. It's taking the exact moment when it finally has the opportunity to build a broad, diverse, economically sustainable fan base, and it's deliberately narrowing that fan base down to only include people who perfectly align with the league's preferred viewpoint. It's treating ideological purity as more important than economic survival. And it's doing this while simultaneously going on television and claiming that it desperately wants the league to grow and succeed. It's almost impossible to overstate how catastrophic this strategy actually is. You cannot build a sustainable, profitable professional sports league by deliberately excluding massive segments of potential customers. You cannot achieve mainstream cultural success while you're simultaneously treating mainstream audiences like they're unwelcome. You cannot claim to want growth while you're actively contracting your tent and pushing people away. And here's the thing that makes it even worse. None of this exclusion was even slightly necessary. Sophie Cunningham could have expressed her views, the league could have put out a statement saying all players are entitled to their own beliefs, and everyone would have moved on by the next day. The Outkick reporter could have asked his questions, the coaches could have given boring, non-committal answers, and the story would have died immediately. But instead, the league made the choice to transform minor moments into massive cultural controversies. And in doing so, they revealed their true institutional priorities. Ideological conformity matters more than economic growth. Control matters more than opportunity. Exclusion matters more than expansion. That's not a winning business strategy. That's a strategy for permanent failure disguised in the language of progressive values. Let's dig deeper into what the coaching responses actually reveal about the institutional dysfunction at the league level. Because these aren't isolated incidents from individual coaches making bad decisions. These are clearly coordinated, scripted responses that come from central league guidance. Someone at the WNBA front office has clearly distributed talking points on how to handle questions about this topic. And those talking points are designed to avoid accountability rather than provide honest answers. When Stephanie White claims she doesn't understand the science well enough to answer a straightforward question, she's not being genuine. She's following a script. She's been coached to deflect, to claim ignorance, to pivot to corporate language about inclusion and conversation. And the fact that she's willing to do this in front of national media tells you something incredibly important. The institutional pressure to avoid certain conversations is so strong that a professional head coach is willing to damage her own credibility on national television rather than risk saying the wrong thing. That should terrify everyone invested in this league's future. Because if your organizational culture is so toxic that it pushes talented, intelligent coaches to pretend ignorance on basic questions, then your organizational culture has become genuinely dysfunctional. You've created an environment where people are so afraid of the consequences of speaking honestly that they'd rather look foolish on camera than tell the truth. That's not the sign of a healthy organization. That's the sign of an organization where fear and control have replaced honest communication and professional trust. And it's not just Stephanie White. Alex Samra displayed the exact same dynamic. He also claimed he'd never thought about the topic. He also pivoted to generic corporate language about supporting people from all walks of life. He also dodged the direct question and pretended he'd answered it when he categorically had not. This is clearly a coordinated approach. This is clearly coming from central messaging. And the fact that multiple coaches at multiple franchises are delivering virtually identical deflections tells you that this isn't spontaneous. This is institutionally directed. The real tragedy here is what this does to the credibility and authenticity of the league. When fans watch these press conferences, they're not seeing coaches who are genuinely wrestling with complex questions. They're seeing performers reading from a script. They're seeing people who are terrified of saying the wrong thing. They're seeing an institution that values control and ideological conformity over honest communication. And that destroys the kind of trust and connection that's essential for building a sustainable fan base. Think about what a healthier response would have looked like. Imagine if a coach had simply said, "Look, this is a complicated topic with legitimate perspectives on different sides. Personally, I believe women's sports categories should be reserved for biological women, and I think that's a reasonable position that a lot of people share. But I respect that other people have different views, and I'm not here to police anyone's personal beliefs. I'm here to coach basketball and support my players, whatever their personal views might be." That would have been honest, direct, respectful, and it would have immediately diffused the entire controversy. Instead, what we got was evasion, deflection, and institutional fear. And that's what's revealed across every level of the league's response to this situation. The leadership is terrified. They're terrified of certain conversations. They're terrified of certain viewpoints. They're terrified of media outlets that don't perfectly align with their perspective. And that terror is driving every single decision they're making, no matter how destructive those decisions are to the league's long-term viability. Here's what makes this especially damaging. Fans can smell fear. When coaches are visibly terrified on camera, when press conferences are being shut down, when fans are being booed for expressing mainstream views, casual observers immediately get the sense that something is very wrong. They sense institutional dysfunction. They sense fear. They sense an organization that's actively at war with itself. And that's not an environment that attracts new fans. That's an environment that repels them. The coaching responses are also revealing something else important: the complete lack of alignment between stated institutional values and actual institutional behavior. The league constantly talks about inclusion, dialogue, and conversation. But the actual institutional response to these situations is to shut down dialogue, prevent conversation, and enforce conformity. That contradiction is visible to everyone. And it's eroding the credibility of anyone in a position of authority within the league. Think about the message this sends to aspiring players, to young women who might want to join the WNBA in the future. The message is, if you have certain viewpoints, if you express certain opinions, if you don't perfectly align with league ideology, you will be shut down. You will be excluded. You will face institutional hostility. That's not going to attract the best talent. That's going to drive talent away to other sports that don't come with this kind of institutional baggage. The coaching dysfunction also reveals something about the actual priorities of league leadership. If your primary concern was authentic growth, if you actually wanted to build a successful, sustainable professional sports league, you would empower your coaches to communicate honestly with media. You would create an environment where tough questions could be answered directly. You would build institutional trust. But that's not what the league is doing. The league is doing the opposite. It's creating an environment where fear and control dominate. And that's the exact opposite of what's needed to build a successful sports league that can stand on its own 2 feet. When you step back and look at the timeline of this entire situation, what becomes immediately apparent is that every single moment of controversy was entirely preventable. I'm not exaggerating when I say that. Every single one of these embarrassing, highly public moments was 100% avoidable with just a tiny bit of basic common sense and professional judgment. But instead of handling these moments professionally, the league actively, deliberately, intentionally chose to escalate each and every one of them into a massive, defining cultural controversy. And in doing so, they transformed what could have been minor, forgettable moments into major, brand-damaging incidents. Let's walk through the timeline of missed opportunities. First, Sophie Cunningham expresses her personal view. That's it. She's a player expressing her personal belief. The professional response? The league puts out a basic statement. All WNBA players are entitled to their own personal beliefs and opinions. And then everyone moves on with their lives. The story dies by the next morning. But that's not what happened. Instead, the situation was allowed to escalate into a massive cultural moment. Then a reporter from Outkick shows up to ask a follow-up question. What's the professional response? The coach gives a straightforward, non-committal answer using standard coach-speak language. Nothing controversial, nothing that takes a personal stance, just the kind of boring, safe response that sports journalists hear every single day. And then everyone moves on. But that's not what happened. Instead, the PR team physically shuts down the press conference. They treat a legitimate media outlet like their enemies. They create the impression that the league has something to hide, and the story doesn't die. Instead, it explodes. Then fans show up to support Sophie Cunningham. They buy tickets, they show up in person, they engage with the product. That's organic fan engagement. That's exactly what sports leagues dream about. The professional response? You let them enjoy the game. You treat them like valued customers. You appreciate that they're spending their money and time to support your league. But instead, they get booed. They're made to feel unwelcome, and the story gets even bigger. At every single turn, the league took an action that made things worse instead of better. At every single juncture, they chose escalation over de-escalation. At every moment, they chose to manufacture drama instead of letting the situation resolve naturally. And the reason they did this is because they were driven by fear and institutional paranoia, not by rational business decision-making. Think about how catastrophically bad this is from a business perspective. You have a new demographic of fans discovering your league for the first time. These fans are enthusiastic, engaged, and spending money. Their engagement is completely organic. They're not being paid to show up. They're not being manufactured by a PR campaign. This is authentic fan interest. And the league's response is to treat them like they're a problem, to boo them, to make them feel unwelcome, to send the message that they're not the kind of fans the league actually wants. What does that tell those fans? It tells them that the league doesn't actually want them. It tells them that their perspective is not welcome. It tells them that they should go back to whatever other sports they were watching before. And that's exactly what's going to happen. Those fans are going to leave, and they're not going to come back. And when they leave, they're going to tell their friends about the experience they had. They're going to share stories about being booed in an arena for supporting a player. They're going to talk about a league that treated them like they weren't welcome. And that word of mouth is going to prevent thousands of other potential new fans from even giving the league a chance. This is how you destroy brand equity. This is how you destroy the possibility of growth. And the league is doing it deliberately, with their eyes wide open, refusing to learn anything from the pattern of their own mistakes. Look at what the league is currently squandering. You have Caitlin Clark, a generational superstar who brought in millions of new viewers. You have Sophie Cunningham organically resonating with a massive demographic that women's basketball has never been able to reach before. You have a major mainstream media outlet that's suddenly interested in covering women's basketball extensively because the league has finally become culturally relevant. You have new fans showing up in person to your arenas. You have sponsors who are suddenly paying attention. You have television networks that want to broadcast your games. This is everything the league has been asking for. This is everything they've been dreaming about. This is the moment they've been working toward for nearly 30 years. And instead of capitalizing on it, instead of seizing this opportunity, instead of building on this momentum, they're systematically dismantling it. The most tragic part of all this is that it was so easy to avoid. So incredibly easy. A basic statement from the league about respecting player-free speech. A straightforward answer from a coach using standard coach-speak language. Professional treatment of a legitimate media outlet. Welcoming fan engagement instead of antagonizing it. That's all it would have taken. And instead of doing those simple, obvious things, the league chose to create a completely toxic environment that repels the exact people who could finally make it financially viable. This isn't just bad business judgment. This is institutional self-sabotage on a scale that's almost hard to comprehend. This is an organization that had finally reached its moment of destiny, and then deliberately chose to walk away from it because the moment didn't align perfectly with its ideological preferences. Let's talk about the core business contradiction that's at the absolute heart of everything happening right now in the WNBA. Because what we're witnessing isn't just incompetence, although there's certainly plenty of that. What we're witnessing is a fundamental, irreconcilable contradiction between the league's stated goals and its actual actions. And that contradiction is going to determine whether the WNBA ever achieves the financial sustainability it's been chasing for 3 decades. The stated goal is growth. Every league executive, every team owner, every coach will tell you that their mission is to grow the league. They want bigger audiences. They want better television ratings. They want more sponsorship money. They want mainstream attention. They've been saying this same thing for nearly 30 years while the league struggled in obscurity and financial deficits. Growth is the official, publicly stated institutional objective. But the actual institutional behavior reveals a completely different priority. The actual behavior suggests that the league's primary objective is not growth, but control. Control over who gets to ask questions. Control over what topics can be discussed. Control over who is welcome in the fanbase. Control over exactly what pre-approved political views are deemed culturally acceptable. And that priority for control is actively, systematically undermining the possibility of growth. You simply cannot have it both ways. That's the fundamental business reality that nobody at the league office ever seems to grasp. You cannot loudly claim to investors that you desperately want massive business growth while simultaneously acting to insulate yourself from the exact new massive audiences that would actually fuel that financial growth. You can't go on television and complain about your television ratings compared to the men's game, and then panic and literally shut down live press conferences the very second a major mainstream media outlet shows up with a microphone. You certainly cannot sit at a podium and talk about bravely leading with conversation, and then immediately turn around and flat out refuse to have any conversations whatsoever with reporters or fans who might dare to ask slightly uncomfortable questions. The sheer level of contradiction coming from the league office right now isn't just confusing. It is genuinely staggering to witness from a supposedly professional organization. Think about what real, actual growth looks like in the sports entertainment industry. Real growth means actively expanding your viewing audience to include people who never previously cared about your product. Real growth means confidently welcoming entirely new perspectives and building a bigger, more inclusive tent for your fan base. Real growth means finally having the maturity and the thick skin to be able to sit at a podium and calmly handle perfectly normal questions from major media outlets that might not perfectly share your institutional biases. That's how real billion-dollar sports leagues operate. The WNBA, by contrast, is doing something entirely different. The league is actively contracting. They're desperately trying to insulate their little bubble from the outside world. They're obsessively trying to micromanage and control exactly who gets the privilege to ask questions while strictly dictating exactly what pre-approved answers are deemed culturally acceptable. They're literally fostering an environment where they're booing their own paying fans and arrogantly shutting the door on major national media outlets. And the wildest part is that they're doing all of this incredibly destructive behavior while simultaneously going on television and loudly claiming to anyone who will listen that they desperately want the league to continue to grow. It's almost Kafkaesque in its contradiction. It's like watching an organization actively, deliberately work against its own stated objectives while claiming complete ignorance about what it's doing. Here's the hard, fundamental truth that nobody at the league office wants to acknowledge. Real sustainable growth requires building a foundational level of trust with a massive, diverse consumer base. And you absolutely cannot build that necessary public trust while you are simultaneously out there publicly demonstrating day in and day out that you will aggressively attack, silence, and shut down anyone and everyone in the building who doesn't perfectly toe the league's preferred ideological line. Those two things are completely incompatible. You cannot build trust through exclusion. You cannot build inclusive growth through hostile, controlling behavior. And mathematically, culturally, it absolutely cannot work. The numbers don't add up. The strategy doesn't work. It's a completely failing business model that contradicts itself at every level. If you want your league to be profitable and sustainable, you need a broad, diverse fan base. You need people with different perspectives, different backgrounds, different political views. You need the tent to be as big as possible. And that requires being welcoming, inclusive, and open to dialogue with people whose perspectives might be different from your own. But if you want ideological purity, if you want institutional control, if you want to limit your fan base only to people who perfectly align with your political views, then you're going to have a smaller audience, weaker television ratings, less sponsorship interest, and continuing financial losses. Those are the only two options available. You cannot have both. You cannot grow a massive, financially sustainable professional sports league while you're simultaneously practicing aggressive ideological gatekeeping. The WNBA is choosing the second option. It's choosing control over growth. It's choosing ideological conformity over financial viability. And it's doing this at the exact moment in history when genuine financial sustainability was finally becoming possible. That's not just bad business. That's catastrophic institutional mismanagement on a scale that's almost incomprehensible. Here's the bottom line. The WNBA had everything handed to it on a silver platter. Caitlin Clark brought in unprecedented mainstream attention and television ratings. Sophie Cunningham organically reached an entirely new demographic. Major media outlets were finally covering women's basketball daily. New fans were showing up in person to arenas. Sponsors were becoming interested. Television networks wanted to broadcast games. For the first time in nearly 30 years, the path to genuine financial sustainability was visible and within reach. All the pieces were perfectly in place for the league to finally win big. But instead of seizing that moment, instead of capitalizing on that opportunity, the WNBA's leadership chose self-sabotage. They chose to escalate minor moments into massive controversies. They chose to shut down legitimate media outlets. They chose to create hostile environments for new fans. They chose control over growth. And in doing so, they're actively destroying the most pivotal moment in the league's entire history. The question isn't whether the WNBA has the talent or the opportunity to succeed. The question is whether the people running it are willing to stop getting in their own way. And based on what we're seeing play out in real time, that answer is becoming painfully, undeniably clear.